I am the coordinator of the Lex Mercatoria line of research at the Claxo. It's wonderful to greet you all here today. So thank you for the initiative by HOMA, the Human Rights and Corporations Center of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. So today we have a panel with an excellent representatives that will provide us with very interesting inputs called Lex Mercatoria, Human Rights and Democracy. We have the participation here of Pedro Ramiro, who we greet very warmly, Dr. Charlotte Beck and Pablo Ignacio Rodriguez Vasco. So we have simultaneous translation, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So we ask our speakers to pause and speak slowly for about 15 minutes each to share their thoughts and knowledge. And afterwards, you can send your questions by the Q&A. And at the end, we'll have the Q&A session. We'll read out all the questions. So we start with Pedro Ramiro. Welcome, Pedro, who is a PhD in chemical science from the Complutense University in Madrid. He's a part of the Multinational Corporations in Latin America Observatory and also leads a project of the association Peace with Dignity to research and denounce the impact of the global expansion of transnational corporations. Among his recent publications, there is the book called Against Lex Mercatoria, co-written with Juan Hernandez Subizarreta, published in 2015, and Where is Spanish Capitalism Heading to? ¿A dónde va el capitalismo español? Co-written with Erika González. So there are several other publications out of Geneva. Corporate power, the Europe of capital, and so we have an opportunity for a new economy in the post-COVID, the green capitalism, welcome refugees, various publications. So it's a huge pleasure, Pedro, to welcome you here today. Pedro Ramiro, it's a very important figure to my own PhD thesis. I want to greet him in a very special way. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Over to you. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you to HOMA for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share with you here. It's already the evening here in Spain. I will try to stay within my time to raise 4 ideas, 4 points that may be useful to analyze the context of the meaning of the relationship between Lex Mercatoria, human rights, and democracy at the global level. So I have these 4 ideas, and I will listen carefully to my fellow panelists. Hopefully we can have a very rich debate at the end. Okay, first idea, the idea that the crisis that we are living through is a systemic crisis. It's a civilizational crisis. It is a crisis that is affecting fully the nuclei of liberal democracy, the hubs of liberal democracy. It's systemic. It is a structural crisis of the economic system we live under, the capitalist system, which has a number of structural problems, very difficult to solve. Basically 3. which is economic stagnation, massive indebtedness, and increase in inequalities, especially social inequality. This triad of factors, stagnation, debt, and inequality, are three factors that structurally make the capitalist system be in crisis, economic and financial crisis permanently. But these socioeconomic factors, if we add also that we are in the midst of an ecological crisis without precedent, what some authors characterize as the Capitalocene, like a new geological era in the history of humankind, as a consequence not of the actions of the human being, but of the capitalist system. Not everybody has the same level of responsibility for the crisis. Capitalism has led the planet to a series of geomorphological changes, and it means that we are entering a new era. The clearest effects are the climate crisis, the climate emergency we're living through, the loss of biodiversity, with many environmental effects. So this is leading to a whole range of geopolitical tensions, to positions we might call far-right, neo-fascist, authoritarian positions taking hold, of disputes between the elites, and a series of tensions in the framework of the capitalist system, which crisscross with the ecological crisis, and also with other structural factors that mean that we are going through this civilizational crisis. These have to do with the coloniality of powers. It's a very deeply racist system, and the whole model of heteropatriarchy. There is a clear inequalities between men and women. So all of this mixed together in a system of multiple forms of domination is leading to a strong crisis of the system of representation, of formal democracy, of liberal democracy. Representative democracy is in crisis. Everything that emerged, the model that emerged and expanded globally, that emerged originally in the glorious 30s, the 30 years after the Second World War, between the mid-40s and the mid-70s, the golden 30 years, this was a period of economic growth where it was compatible to expand capitalism at national and global level with the expansion of a series of benefits for most of society, which was known as the welfare state. So redistribution of wealth, high taxes, public services, etc. In the mid-70s, this model entered a crisis with all the neoliberal crisis, the financialization of life to this day. And this crisis is demonstrably a structural crisis of capitalism. We cannot go back to that peaceful coexistence between the rights of liberal democracy plus economic expansion. So we are entering a period where there is a deepening utilitarianism. More and more is becoming more authoritarian, and a model that is advancing not just in a few countries, but actually globally. These post-fascist, neo-fascist, far-right positions, however we want to call them, where there is a competition between the poor, among the poor, a war of the poor against the poor, helping the political corporate elites to remain in power. That was the first idea. So the second idea, this crisis of democracy, of liberal democracy as a result of this whole systemic crisis, there is a decomposition of the human rights system. everything that had been the international human rights system constituted after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, all the way through the successive pacts, agreements, declarations that have taken place since then, that have been approved since then. So when we reach the 21st century, this whole framework enters a period of decompositions because there is a mercantilization, a commodification of life, knowledge, everything that can be bought and sold is commodified. Above the general interest, above the individual rights. And this leads to a destruction of rights and to a sort of territorial pillage and violence and criminalization of people and organizations that oppose this model. So let us say that what is prioritized over the course of the 20th century and the 21st century is the formation of a global economic constitution, a whole series of agreements, a global normative framework. It's not a document, it's not a treaty, it's thousands of norms, of conditional loans, of guidelines from the IMF, the World Bank, of treaties, of investment and trade treaties at bilateral, regional, and multilateral level, WTO rules, international arbitration panels. In other words, there's this whole architecture, legal architecture of impunity, basically, an international legal order that privileges the rights of business, of corporations, over and above the rights of people, of peoples, and of nature. So in this context, what we call Lex Mercatoria, this range of international agreements and norms that favor investment funds and corporations globally, rides roughshod over human rights. There is an asymmetry between the strength of Lex Mercatoria and the vulnerability, the weakness of the international human rights system. So there are arbitration courts and panels to make sure that Lex Mercatoria is abided by, is complied with, and with sanctions, with economic blockades, with pressure, with debt, etc. And what about the obligations of these corporations with the rights of the communities affected by their operations, the workers affected, the peoples affected, and nature? Because these norms, these bodies, these agencies do not exist to defend them. So an oil company, for instance, like Repsol, was operating in Argentina for 2 decades. When it was nationalized by the Argentinian government, it resorted to the national courts in Argentina, in Spain, in the United States, because it was on the Wall Street, and also the World Bank court. The Mapuche communities affected only have the national Argentinian legislation. They have the Inter-American Human Rights Court, but have a lot less than Repsol had to resort to. Fewer options. And so this asymmetry leads to the impunity of the abuses committed by these corporations. So the international human rights system is fragile because companies have activities are defended internationally, but their obligations are limited by the national legislation. And so human rights are boxed in and they're very hard to apply in practice. So the so-called social responsibility of the corporations, which is this extra norms that the companies say they abide by, it has been clearly, demonstrably shown to be greenwashing and just social marketing. So, third idea now. This decomposition of the international human rights system means that there's a reconfiguration, a sort of categories of rights. There are rights that are individual and collective, that are differentiated, depending on social class, on social extraction, nationality, and who is the subject or are the subjects that these rights are applicable to. So we see that clearly with migrant people who want to enter the European Union, for example. They are either expelled or stopped militarily at the border or put into prisons without having committed any crime. These are these internment camps, internment centers that we have, for example, in Spain. They are in these internment centers, and their only crime, or quote unquote crime, was trying to enter the country. Many die, of course, on the way, trying to cross the Mediterranean, and nobody comes to their aid. This is a model we can call necro capitalism. It's a strong word. It's a model of dispossession, of death, of expulsion, and necropolitics in the sense that, as Membe said, to let die those people that are not valuable, that are not useful, that don't consume, that are not functional to the system. Let them die in armed conflict, let them drown in the Mediterranean, etc. So there's this reconfiguration of rights, of categories of rights, and it would seem that there are different rights depending on your nationality in the United States or in the European Union, that we see that very clearly, but also according to your skin color, your social class, your bank account, etc. So another example that is close to us that has to do not just with immigrants. During the pandemic in Spain, in March of 2020 in Madrid, the city where I live, from where I'm speaking to you, the seniors living in care homes that were public, with public money, sustained with public money, many of them were not treated in hospital for COVID. They were left to die because they weren't important for the system. The elderly who had private insurance and had private health care, private health insurance, some companies provide this for their employees. They were treated, they received hospital care. Of course, some died, but others didn't. So there was a differential treatment to people, in this case, not because of their country of origin or their skin color, but because of their social class. The difference between relying on the public health system or having private health insurance. So that's pure necropolitics in my eyes. So fourth idea to conclude, in this context, when it seems that the pandemic is starting to go away and we're starting to talk about the reconstruction of the economic model here in Europe, there's a sort of a new the European Green Deal, taking its cue from the New Deal in the United States, but with this green addition, this reconstruction, which is nothing but renewed capitalism with yellow tinges, purple tinges, and rainbow tinges, but with no challenge of global capitalism. Without a confrontation, a strong conflict with the central hubs, the central nuclei of the capitalist system, it will not be possible to change this state of affairs. We often talk about the need for control mechanisms. Of course, there are to be able to undo a little this asymmetry between Lex Mercatoria and human rights, mechanisms of control at the international level. Um, there's a treaty being discussed in the United Nations about human rights and corporations, yes. Also at regional level, the European Union is talking about a due diligence directive at national level, local level, but something that goes beyond declarations. This idea of due diligence is nothing more than declarations, statements of intent. We need binding norms to control capital, and this is just an idea that I raise here, is not so much a question of legal technique, but of political struggle. We are here in a seminar with many of you are jurists and know a lot about laws and legislation. It's fundamental for social change and transformation. But without political will, there will not be any legislation, there will not be any regulation that changes this state of affairs. Currently, there are many norms that could be used to change the state of affairs, and they are not used. They are not implemented for a lack of political will. And others that could be created, that could be implemented, and this is not done because there is a wish to continue favoring the corporate political elites. But we don't only need control mechanisms, but also norms that are binding, that are at least as strong as Lex Mercatoria in favor of corporations. We need to have networks, transnational counter-hegemonic networks, whether at academic level, connected to social organizations, political, trade unions, communities affected by major corporations, the organizations of human rights, women, ecologists, anti-racists, etc., and that among all of us, all these collectives, all these people, we should gather together and accumulate the significant people support, popular support, social support to build and continue building, because this is already happening to some extent, to build new economic models and new models of society. Only in that way can we undo this asymmetry between human rights and Lex Mercatoria and put the rights of people, of peoples, and of nature on the vertex, on the cusp of the wave, at the top of the pyramid of norms that currently is upside down. Corporations are at the top and the majority are at the bottom. So to invert that normative pyramid, we need these networks of counter-hegemonic transnational organizations and individuals and spaces such as this where we can continue building activism among juries, among intellectuals, social organizations of every kind from all over the world. I would leave it there.
Perfecto el tiempo, doctor Pedro, muchísimas gracias. Efectivamente, aquí tenemos grandes ideas, ejes centrales, puntuales.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro. We are going to keep on discussing things, especially considering the current crisis, because the current crisis is affecting the human rights system. Also, we know that the lack of control mechanisms favor the asymmetry. Thank you so much for your talk, and it's great to count on you as a comrade in our struggle. all of us have to do what we can do to fight the good fight. Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro. Later on, we're going to have a debate, and it's going to be great to listen to you again. Thank you so much. Now let's host Dr. Charlotte back. She's a lawyer. She is a doctor in social science by UNESA University in Spain. She holds a BA in law by the Rio de Janeiro Federal University. She is a researcher at HOMA, and she works with all of us here, and she's providing support also in Classical. She's also a member in the Latin American Council of Justice and Democracy. She's also a member of the sector of human rights in the landless workers movement in Brazil. And she's also the vice president of the Commission of International Law of Rio de Janeiro. Hi, everybody. Hi, Veronica. I'm going to speak Portuguese because I don't speak a very good Spanish. I speak some Portunhol. I'm going to speak slowly so that you can do the translation. I would like to thank Manuela for inviting me to be here again. And it's a pleasure to be with you once again. Thank you so much for discussing important matters for democracy in Brazil. And we need to discuss the role companies play in fostering economy in a society such as Brazil, especially when we consider that Brazil is such a rich country, especially in natural resources, but Brazil has become the land where neoliberalism is expanding, a kind of authoritarian neoliberalism. I would like to thank Veronica, I would like to thank Richie, and I would like to thank Veronica for being the mediator. It's an honor for me to be here with Pedro Rodriguez and Pablo Ignacio. For me, it's challenging to deliver a presentation after listening to Professor Pedro. It was great to listen to him, and I feel that what he addressed here connects very well with the ideas that I'm going to exploit now. Maybe my comrade Pablo Ignacio Rodriguez is going to talk about it, but I would like to let you know that Pedro Ignacio and we have written an article on mining companies in Ecuador, and we wrote this article about mining companies, and we would love it if you could read the article. Basically, what we wanted to do in this panel is to talk about human rights, Lex Mercatoria, and democracy. So after dealing with the overview introduced by Professor Pedro Ramirez, I believe that one of the things that connects well with the concept of capitalism that he set forth here, based on the context of crisis that have been created to stimulate and reinforce authoritarian neoliberalism. And especially in the context of a pandemic we are still facing a pandemic in Brazil, we need to discuss philanthrocapitalism. That's an issue that academy hasn't discussed well until now, but I believe that it's something important for us to tackle, especially when we consider Brazil's historical moment. Now we are in the hands of big companies, especially large pharmaceutical companies, which are the ones that produce the vaccines. I believe that you're aware, foreigners are aware. First, we had a scandal related to purchasing vaccines in Brazil. At first, the Brazilian government had no action whatsoever as regards purchasing the vaccines. And we know that in other countries, the same thing happened. When we observe the figures show clearly to us that the vaccines and the rate of vaccination has helped us to protect people. And it can also be seen as a colonizing action, especially when we consider that countries in the global north, they have access to cheaper vaccines and easier access. And how does philanthrocapitalism relate to that? Philanthrocapitalism in this context that Professor Rodriguez introduced for us, the philanthrocapitalism term was used first in 2006 by Professor Shaw, and he was an editor to the Economist magazine. And it was the first time that this term was used publicly. From that moment on, not only he, but other scholars too have been studying the phenomenon. And the article he wrote was The Dawn of Philanthrocapitalism. In 2006, the term was coined, philanthrocapitalism. And what is it about? Philanthrocapitalism means that there is a new approach to traditional philanthropy. In this new context, in the context of neoliberalism, and especially authoritarian philocapitalism, it's basically philanthropy based on financial donations, and those donations are used to improve people's quality standards of life. But those donations come from large international companies. Therefore, philanthrocapitalism shows a trend of a new generation of donors, not only considering donors that have always been around, but also showing different objectives. Let's say profit-seeking objectives. Also, those objectives, they can be measured by the verticalization of philanthropy. Those philanthrocapitalists, they say they are social investors. They say that they're creating a new way of doing philanthropy. This new way of doing philanthropy is okay with making a profit and also to observing a cost and benefit ratio related to donations. And also it is open to measure initiatives that are linked to philanthrocapitalism. And what's the important thing that we should consider? Not only is philanthropic capitalism really connected to the world and to the decisions of where making the investment, where sending the funds, that's largely connected to investment, basically, in certain areas, especially in the global south. Those companies and foundations who introduce those opportunities, those investment opportunities, they no longer donate money to governments. Now they want to join the decision-making process and shape the initiatives that are going to receive the funds. Therefore, funds are really linked to certain projects or linked to certain conditionalities. And as Professor Rodriguez has said, now we are facing financial capitalism, and financial institutions also adhere to this built nature. They belonged to this format of submission, submitting the global south to decisions that are taken in the global north. Therefore, charity in philanthropic capitalism is no longer something that you're going to do because you're a good person or that you want to show how nice you are. Basically, charity has become a good business. Philanthropic capitalism tries somehow to capture what capitalism can do to work as if they were doing something for humanity, as if capitalists and the companies were giving back what they got from society. However, we know that that doesn't show well, and we know that some interests are concealed. And we need to understand where is the money being invested, who are the people who are going to receive the benefit. But the thing is, behind the funds that would help people basically, or help countries basically, we know that there's a discourse and a whole logic, colonizing logic. And we can also say that there is a necropolitics logic, just like Professor Rodriguez introduced. Therefore, philanthropic capitalism is a very useful strategy, and large international companies resort to it. For example, large companies, they do business, and they also have some departments focused on this. And they say social responsibility department, because this is a strategy to expand business and make money through philanthropy and with this so-called charity. This strategy is something that was created as neoliberalism was exacerbated, especially in the 1990s. There has always been philanthropy ever since the dawn of capitalism. And in the past, it was really connected to Christianity and the Catholic Church. And we could say that from the 18th or 19th centuries on, there has been some tendency of applying a lay logic and in detriment of a Christian logic. And philanthropy has been used ever since. Philanthropy became something important in big companies' business strategy. Currently, philanthropy is one of the big businesses available. We know too well that you can destroy a country, and later on, non-governmental institutions enter the country, foundations enter the country to rebuild the country. Haiti is a very good case study for us to take a look at, because Haiti was completely destroyed more than once. And we could even say that Haiti is the, the place where organizations go to, and plenty of organizations, they pretend they're going to do philanthropy in Haiti, but actually they're doing money laundering. We know that Haiti is still one of the poorest countries in the world. Haiti lacks infrastructure, and we know that Haiti is a favorable place for money laundering. Also, those big companies, they act as if they're going to help Haitians who actually need international aid. This logic reinforces the idea that there are civilized people. Basically, those civilized people are the ones who have the possibility of creating democracy, because they're the ones who know the neoliberal model. They're the ones who share knowledge and culture with other people. On the other hand, as Boaventura Santos would say, on one side, there are the civilized, and on the other side, there are the invisible people. They are the uncivilized people. They're the people who are regarded as if they had no culture. They're the people who relate to folk culture as if they had no scientific knowledge whatsoever. Therefore, this division of the world is replicated by the logic of companies, and also by the logic of social responsibility by the type of philanthropy that big companies do nowadays internationally. How do those big companies introduce themselves? They introduce themselves as big philanthropers, big donors, as big business, and they're going to provide services to the population, and also as tools to handle social conflicts. One of the biggest problems that we have in the global South countries, food insecurity, housing, education, all of those challenges in the global South are linked to the issues, and that those international institutions invest in those things. They make the investment not necessarily to say that inequality was socially built. They simply deal with the social conflict to keep inequality as it is. maybe people's standards of life improve a little bit. However, the unequal structure doesn't change. And we know that social unequal structure is what creates inequality. Therefore, what we see today is subordinating welfare, subordinating the fight against poverty to the financial market. And we know that philanthrocapitalism does that. Philanthrocapitalism has reinforced the logic of capitalism itself, reinforcing the logic of neoliberalism itself, which is a logic of showing and trying to reinforce a so-called inefficiency of the state compared to a supposed efficiency of the market. They say countries are inefficient. Therefore, companies should go to countries and actually cater to people's needs. The state is pictured as inefficient. And how can things get better? By allowing international countries, transnational companies to join a country. That means not only receiving the funds, but also letting transnational companies take decisions. Therefore, taking decisions as regards public policies, especially when we consider this privatization idea, the decisions are taken by private entities. And those decisions are taken by certain people who are seeking profit, who are seeking mercantilizing people's lives. Also, those companies, not only do they show that the state is inefficient, those companies, they also act as if they were not, they had no other interest. When they make the donation, it's as if they are not going to benefit from the donation. But we know that those companies, they receive tax relief, they receive tax incentives by countries, and they also have some conditions. Oftentimes, companies that do a certain project in a certain area, in a certain country, they get a bid in another area in that same country. And we also know that those international institutions benefit from philanthrocapitalism.
So philanthrocapitalism is not financed exclusively by corporations. The corporations receive incentives, tax incentives from states. So states receive fewer tax revenues in order to encourage, to stimulate the entry of these corporations in the country. The main foundation today regarding health is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This foundation was created by Bill Gates. Today, it is focused, its main focus, including the budgetary focus, is on the World Health Organization. Of the 2019 budget of the WHO, 10% of the money comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we see that the foundation contributes to WHO, which is a voluntary contribution, and this contribution is linked to an agenda established by the foundation. So the money doesn't go into the general fund, the general bank account, so to speak, of the World Health Organization, and is managed collectively by the members of the organization. No, this money is linked to a certain agenda that was formulated privately by the Gates Foundation. One final point. It's the second largest funder of the WHO. It loses out only to the United States. So the foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, contributes more than all the countries in the world with the single exception of the United States. The organization, therefore, undergoes, the decisions made by the organization undergoes consequences, not just from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also other philanthropists that fund it. And what does this, why is this funding a problem? This funding institutes a certain humanitarianism that is selective. This selective humanitarianism is demonstrated by means of investments by the WHO in illnesses that are prevalent, or research into illnesses that are prevalent where? In developing countries. Illnesses that we call neglected, like malaria, illnesses, tropical illnesses, tuberculosis, lepra. They are illnesses that are not, they don't receive attention from pharmaceutical, from big pharma, because there's no funding for that, because they are illnesses of the global south. So inside the WHO, the same logic gets reproduced of hierarchization, so to speak, of human beings. Some have lives that are worth more, and others have lives that are worth less. So this selective humanitarianism is a result of the maintenance of these structures of exclusion that have extremely negative consequences for social rights as a whole, and particularly on the groups that are the most vulnerable, economically, socially, and politically. So following along on this idea of necropolitics that Professor Pedro mentioned, we are talking about lives that are really worthless. Lives that, unlike the Foucaultian social critique, the activity in these spaces becomes, the political activity is not just a life work, but a death work, where there is unlimited exploitation of workers, commodification of the essential spheres of their lives, like public health, and the creation of an environment of constant insecurity, fear, distrust, and dispute between people. One alarming fact about the WHO is the 1090 gap. The 1090 gap means less than 10% of the resources for research and health go to illnesses that account for 90% of the global burden of illness. So 10% of the research budget, 10% of the money go to the illnesses that are the real killers, and 90% of the illnesses that are basically of the global south. And where do the 90% research funds go? To illnesses that affect only 10% of the global population. Chronic disease like diabetes, cancer, and autoimmune diseases. So the logic of investment is the logic that reinforces the inferiority, the coloniality, and consequently, the annihilation of lives on a large scale, which is what is so-called necropolitics. We notice, therefore, that the social issue in the global south is no longer to be solved by public policies, by democratically elected officials. So there is more and more the commodification, the monetization of public policies, and this becomes managed by institutions that have no commitment to democracy, people's participation, even individual participation, without any kind of commitment to the public sphere, the public interest. In this regard, global health was one of the main spaces for the entry of philanthrocapitalism, because it was one of the first spaces that suffered from privatization, particularly in the countries of Latin America and the African continent. I wanted to make a contribution to the debate. We don't have any major conclusions. We have an analysis of what we see today in the discussion about global health, and this health connected to the setting of neoliberalism. So I wanted to leave to you this perspective based on this field, the field of health, and only reinforces what we call selective humanitarianism. Humanitarian policies are done only for some humans. There's a division between humans that deserve care and access to health and those that are subhuman and don't deserve access to health and spaces of cure and prevention. So I want to say thank you, Veronica, for the space. I think that's it for me. It's a suggestion for the conversation to continue. Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. It's a pleasure. We always want more time for the reflection, for the contributions. It's a pity that this philanthropy it's part of the social responsibility. It's not part of its DNA. This is complete. This legal architecture of impunity is completely violated. Human rights continue to be violated instead of there being a love for humankind. So thank you very much for your contributions. There are many questions already coming in, but I remind you all, but I think you should, I remind everyone that you can use the Q&A and the chat function. And at the end, we will open for some oral questions. Thank you, Charlotte. Now we continue with Paulo Inácio Rodrigues Vasco, an excellent professor, colleague, a friend who holds a master's in international relations, is a PhD candidate, is researching China and human internationalism, works as a researcher at Flaxo, Ecuador, and excellent work that we all know about. Welcome, Dr. Rodriguez. It's a pleasure to greet you. Hello, Veronica. Hello to all the members of the public, members of the panel. Can you see me well? Yes, perfectly well. Go ahead. So I want to begin with a sentence by Naomi Klein. And I like it because it describes very well what Pedro Ramiro was talking about, and also Charlotte. In this type of capitalism, the war of capitalism against the climate and human rights, in this regard, it's an uncomfortable truth and comfortable truth, and sometimes we have a denialist speech in terms of human environmental rights, much more than when we talk about mining companies. At this moment, I'm going to share my screen. Please tell me if you can see my shared screen. Yes, perfectly. So now I will talk about a chapter that I wrote with Professor Charlotte Black and Manuela Roland. It's such a pleasure to be here sharing this with you all. Thank you also to Homa for allowing me to present our chapter about Chinese mining companies and human rights in Ecuador. So San Marcos, a case of forced displacement, and the importance of an international treaty about corporations and human rights. By way of introduction, we can say that in recent decades, there's an internationalist strategy of the Chinese model of development. This began with the initiative in the 90s when the Chinese economy was going through a period of stagnation and accumulation of internal factors that were putting at risk its development. So the Communist Party experts started this idea of projecting the Chinese economy to other territories and mobilizing resources to avoid a crisis of excess accumulation. So the first, during the 1990s and the start of the 21st century, so the Chinese investment went into strategic areas of the economy, including Latin America. So after the declaration of Santa Cruz, Bolivia, China starts emphasizing the need to becoming closer to Latin America. And how do they do this? Through the Belt and Road Initiative, an initiative that involves the development of infrastructures for the region and seeks to promote the logic of development in other countries, and particularly the South-South cooperation. But it also has a gain at the geopolitical level, a redistribution of geoeconomic power, projecting its influence in Latin America, and a pressure on the United States. Also a win-win idea of cooperation, because it allows China not only to undo its internal crisis, but also fight for influence in new industries like the mining industry and increase its economic benefits. So Chinese investment is securitized not only militarily, as we see in Africa, but also in Latin America. There's another level of securitization in terms of the influence of China on national agreements. And this has an implication for human rights and environmental rights. So in this sense, for Latin America, there was a plan for cooperation +1, +2, +3. So trade, finance, and investment. So the idea is to change the Going Global initiatives, so not just the capture of mineral wealth, but also political influence on the territory. So we're talking in this initial period, as I mentioned earlier, between 2000 2008, there's a complementarity based on the Belt and Road with a political influence and direct influence over the national legislations of extractive industries. So in mining, Latin America accounts for 70% of copper reserves of China in the world. And so the expansion is to new deposits of copper in new countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia. So there's an expansion of the extractive frontier, entering indigenous areas and areas of environmental protection. This means that in Ecuador and Peru, there has been the development of the mining industry and a great regression of economic and environmental rights, because in the whole of the Amazonian region, there have been 450 violations against in indigenous communities by Chinese corporations. 63 of the 450 have been in Equatorian territory, mainly linked to mining projects like the Mirador project. So the idea is to see how the flexibilization of the juridical framework actually weakens the protective role of the states in relation to the community. So we want to calculate the effects on politics at national level, policies at national level, and interpret how these changes generate an impact on the localities, and to see the importance of an international treaty. And so in terms of the theoretical approach, so it's international political economy, because it allows us to understand development, an agenda that is put together by many interests beyond the national interests. So a national development agenda, there are many other players, national and international, that are playing politically with their interests and that can direct the development agenda towards their own interests. In this case, the local elites in the mining sector and the international elites of the multinational corporations, in our case, the Chinese corporations. So the new geography of development. So states and corporations are weaving together a complex web of interests that compromise human rights and direct development towards private interests. So it's corporate capture by transnational corporations and the state. And what is the result? Within international political economy, at the international level, Latin America has resorted to this, but in Ecuador we have two matrices. The first is the economic nature. So Chinese investments in Ecuador, for the size of Ecuador, China in the last decade was the main financier for strategic industries like copper and energy. And also in a second area, it's a regime of violence against human rights. So as a result of the corporate capture of the state by Chinese transnationals, there is this flexibilization of the human rights framework. And this marginalization generates victims, communities that are victims. So as we move towards private interests, then we see communities of affected parties. These are vicious cycles of pollution, contamination, and poverty. So climate change is not just an environmental question, but a problem that is a social problem.
When we consider community and indigenous groups in the region, we can see that there is a tension, not only in the borders, but also here we can see it, and Lex affect it very much, especially as regards lobby. And there are companies and states working together. Basically, the governments started working to cater to the needs of big corporations. And the objective power has been given to companies, basically. There has been a vulnerabilization of the processes of consulting with communities. Also, there's lack of catering to the needs of communities. Also, the right to previous consultation is increasingly more difficult. We have seen plenty of drawbacks in this process in the region, in Latin American region. When international economy affects a region, there's a process of appropriation of the territory. And also there's a reconfiguration of the territory. For instance, in the Equatorian Amazon area, plenty of mining companies have been working in that area. Here we can see that Lex Mercatoria is working at the local level in the Equatorian Amazon. Ever since that happened, legislation in Ecuador has changed. Also, we can see a sequence of investment that is linked to the action of large companies. Oftentimes, federal governments take over indigenous land and then pass the land on to big corporations. And therefore, the territories, they are used by the big corporations, no longer used by indigenous communities. For instance, in 2016, there was a process of eviction of certain communities, and the private sector took over. Plenty of people in the communities fought back, and then there was a milestone that was set. Also, in the process, women faced violence. All of those problems, they happened not only in Ecuador, but in other parts of Latin America. When we consider the Amazon, there have been wildfires in the Amazon over the period. And when we consider environmental rights as something to protect communities, this is something that governments have been giving it up and offering it to big corporations. The communities and tribes no longer take part in the decision-making process. Basically, we can question the standards. We know that there's resistance and there's rupture with European-centered international law. we are resorting to other forms of dealing with issues. Basically, we are seeking collective construction to protect human rights and actually help communities thrive and uphold human rights in the process. Currently, there's a law against capitalism, and this war is also to protect our survival. Basically, through international agreements, we want to strengthen political and civil and collective participation processes, as well as catering to the needs of communities so that the treaties can actually protect those communities. Basically, in our article, we concluded that human rights, we have learned that human rights are at stake when state power and corporate companies, they change the laws to protect human rights. And that is a problem for indigenous communities. Also, there is a rupture process where we know that governments are using an international project of development in detriment of indigenous communities. Also, we know the importance of Resolution 26.9 to cater to the rights so that civil society can demand better rights for all. Thank you so much for your remarks, Pablo. I would like to thank you for being here, and I would like to thank Andres and all Homa team, the Claxo team as well. Thank you so much. Now I would like to just add one comment. When we consider what happened as regards the Lex Mercatoria, now that we have a theory linked to it, we have seen in plenty of different occasions, not only considering what Pedro Ramiro said and Charlotte Beck said, we know that the evolution of the concept of Lex Mercatoria is not necessarily linked to annihilation of people, but we know that the theory that each and every contract that have been firmed, that have been signed between companies and the states, basically national laws, they show that they are serving interests and needs of a private group. And we know that power for those companies is going over the interests, and all of the laws and everything is catering to the needs of companies in detriment of the people. And people can't even complain. And we know that plenty of communities, they are even more vulnerable now because big companies, go to their territories and they affect those people's traditions and territory. Therefore, the lack of legitimacy in international law connects to the power of certain groups. And we know that private groups, they want the government to serve them in detriment of the people. Therefore, we have this responsibility. Basically, la Lex Mercatoria, it doesn't cater to the people's needs. It basically caters to private institutions and also individual rights in detriment of collective rights. And the law, domestic law, is ignored. And the transnational networks, they could use semi-international contracts that have been signed between states and big companies. That happens so often. International society, and as Charlotte said, philanthropy is not paradise, and we see relationships of power and manipulation, and also a money-making driven action. For instance, we see that often in Colombia, and we see that the companies are basically making money. The government basically serves the companies. It's not a legal system. There is no universality of or autonomy or effectiveness whatsoever. When we consider international law, basically it's a set of commercial behaviors that are put together. Unfortunately, there's a bad interpretation that this is something that is going to cater to the needs of people. When we consider the mercatory law, it doesn't deal with issues related to the contracts that are going to be signed. There's been arbitration showing that state law is going to rule on that. For this reason, mercatory law is basically something that looks like the lottery. When we consider that the contract is going to be interpreted by what we know in the mercatory law, and as Buenaventura de Souza has said, there's a conventional paradigm that should prevail. Law should be assimilated, produced by the state, and generate a certain institutionalization of the norms and providing security and previsibility of behaviors for us to actually manage administration. Therefore, law is something that the state creates, that, as Hobbes said, basically, the Mercatoria law is linked to accepting what private entities want to. And the domestic law is repressed. There is no autonomy or independence in this process. And in this effort of criticizing and legitimizing and also providing power to the people. When we consider Colombia, for instance, we still have the national plan for companies and human rights. And currently, there has been a launching by the national government. And here in Colombia, in 2021 and 2022, considering Lex Mercatoria, we are going to update things. Also, we're going to implement what has been set forth before. And the criticism based on all of those problems, people ignore the diagnosis as if it were an answer to the violation of human rights by companies. Civil society and vulnerable communities, they have no voice. And here in Colombia, we see indigenous people being killed every day, human rights defenders being killed every day. And this persecution, especially against certain interests, we see that private interests are placed above collective interests. The government has been unable to cater to the needs of human rights. And this strategy of Lex Mercatoria, and we know that here in Colombia, the pandemic just triggered more human rights violations. And especially when we consider what our company is going to do now. Are companies going to cater to human rights needs? Probably they're not. When we consider civil society institutions and other institutions, we need to actually lay the ground for people to participate so that we can protect human rights and we can cater to reparations. And I would like to say once again, there has been no diagnosis over the territories, and all the analysis carried out until now, we see that there's no public participation, no timely participation due to lack of information. The plan has been created basically civil society and the government working and the companies, and we continue to see the same problems, the lack of effective participation for reparations. In certain places, people didn't have the true opportunity of voicing their concerns. We had to deal with the space to actually protect human rights. Here in Colombia, fulfilling those obligations has been a challenge. And this action has been difficult. And we need to adapt, come together. And we need a binding treaty. We know that it's not only one norm, it's a set of norms. And this global legal body is going to allow us so that control mechanisms can actually provide support for people who need it. Inverting the pyramid and recognizing that each and every human being is equal and overthrowing the current structure and cater to the needs of each and every person. And in international context, we need to create interaction between companies, civil society, people, in the best scenario possible. Therefore, we favor the interests of all. Thank you so much. That this is our panel. Now I give the floor to our assistants and the participants. And I would like to thank the whole team, Manuela. Hello, Veronica. I would like to say hello to all.
Unfortunately, I wasn't here right from the beginning to greet you. Hello, Charlotte, Pedro, Pablo, Veronica. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, your contribution. There are questions already in the chat, so I'm not going to take up so much time, but I would like to nevertheless make a comment which perhaps connects the evening panel with this panel, the role of the judiciary, the justice system as the guarantor of human rights, the democratic rights. It's one of the hands of the state as well, of course, and this Latin American reality we're living today. So there are some questions regarding human rights reparations. So the judiciary is currently much more supporting the corporate point of view other than to the detriment of the affected populations. So when we struggle over the treaty, I don't know if you all agree, there's this idea of monitoring, control, coercion. Of course, first of all, establishing mechanisms of control and then mechanisms of reparation for human rights violations. But I think deep down, and this is a dialogue with what all of you have said so far, the question of putting corporations in another place, take it out of the role of the agent of development, which is the strongest discourse in the UN and is instrumentalized, and in a way, reaffirms the validity of Lex Mercatoria. So you cannot advance effectively with this agenda if you don't question this. What is behind this whole struggle? Because people talk about narrative wars. So the idea is to take the corporations out of this role, out of this place, that it's a rational, neutral actor. So their pursuit of profit is disinterested and neutral, and this logic has to be preserved at every cost, particularly in the global south, which bought into this whole package of attracting foreign direct investment. It becomes even harder considering that these neoconservative governments have strengthened this logic, which is not specific to them, but is further enhanced in the recent past. I think it's polemical to say I think the development discourse is also very negative, deleterious. This idea that there was a deviation since the Declaration of the Right to Development of 1986 to the present, there was a greater appeal about the development of the peoples, and this got lost along the way because we lose. It's like a scale of development, right? Comparative scale, and we take out from this international outlook the spirit of collectivity and solidarity. Oh, Brazil is better than Africa, so Brazil is not Venezuela, Brazil is not Ecuador. Oh, it could get worse. And we don't notice what is the real trap, which is that we're all linked to this international globalized capitalism. We are in the same side. So, sometimes Brazilians put themselves in this place. Oh, we're a little better. There's no development without human rights and democracy. And in Brazil, we can't talk about any of these three without breaking through imperialism, patriarchy, colonialism, the deep-seated questions. So a transition that we haven't gone through effectively yet. So there was this neo-developmentalism recently, and we see how easy it was to regress. So we continue dependent as a commodity exporter, like all countries in the southern globe, in the global south. So maybe we reposition ourselves slightly differently, but fundamentally nothing has changed. So the fact that we experienced this in a period of depoliticization, but there was also a role of the judiciary. Instead of being an actor that is a guarantor of human rights, is clearly at the service of a corporate capture that made Brazil this political capture, which was the 2016 coup in Brazil, under this discourse of combating corruption, which is a discourse, once again, it's repeated all over Latin America. So I want to say a special thank you and leave it there. Let's go to the questions from the public. Thank you, Manuela. Always a pleasure. We have every admiration for this wonderful contribution in the face of the inequalities that we are living through. So thank you for your contribution. So now we are going to go to the questions. Initially, a question for Charlotte that says, there's a question that said, can one apply the logic to the Sustainable Development Goals and other voluntary initiatives in the sense that companies decide how they're going to benefit society and contribute to a positive image rather than it being an effective development method? Can you hear me? I can't hear you guys very well. I couldn't hear you earlier. I changed my network. I think the problem is over here with me. So the question, once again. The question is, can one apply the logic that you mentioned to the objectives of sustainable development and other voluntary initiatives, in the sense that corporations choose how they will benefit society and how they will contribute to a positive image of the corporation, even if it's not an effective form of development. Well, like Manuela, good to see you, Manuela. The Sustainable Development Goals, this whole construct within the United Nations is a discussion that has much to contribute to the issue, particularly of the treaty, the binding treaty for corporations. However, it's important to reflect about the meaning of this discourse. So what is this development? Development for whom? What is behind it? So today is a moment of discussing what is the meaning, what is the rationale behind this development. This development is sustainable, but sustainable for whom? Once again, for which countries, for which people, and sustainable to what extent? Respecting cultures, or with a sustainable in a north-south perspective? I think it's a gain, it's an advance that we're discussing the sustainable development goals, the goals of the millennium, etc. But we must look at the extent to which this development is not just a reproduction of what has already been done in the past, of the logics of that are patriarchal, colonial, that have been reinforcing more and more the subordination in different ways, with different discourses. When we see, for example, the anti-corruption discourse or human rights discourse or the environment. So the role of social movements and academia, civil society to dispute over, to fight over the meaning, to avoid it becoming yet another form of subordination. I don't know if you can understand me. Yes, don't worry. We understood. Okay, does anybody wanted to ask a question orally? Please do so. Maybe there are questions in the chat. Can you help me? Because the question, I think, maybe can you read out the question, Manuela?
Porque acá tenemos una pregunta de Jean-Luc de Claculus Lima. No sé si desea participar.
So there was a question about the guiding principles. Felipe Assanza Miranda, do you consider that the UN principles can help strengthen the corporate social responsibility and create a healthy environment for human rights? Y también si es posible crear, if it's possible to create a link between capitalism and necropolitics.
Okay, adelante, doctor Pedro.
Pedro, please, Dr. Pedro, please.
Sí. Voy a responder. Bueno, sobre la cuestión de los
regarding the guiding principles.
¿Me escucha? ¿Todo bien, no?
Can you hear me?
Perfecto, sí.
Yes, go ahead.
Sobre la cuestión de los principios rectores,
The questions about the guiding
estaba
principles.
poniendo ahí en las respuestas un par de
I was writing a
enlaces
couple
a
of
dos artículos
links for articles in the chat
publicamos este año
that we published this year
con el profesor Juan Hernández Ubizarreta
with Professor Zubizarreta
sobre la lógica de la diligencia de vida,
about
que sé que
the logic of
tenéis
due diligence.
otro
And I know you're going to have a panel
seminario
about
donde
that
hablen
in this
de
seminar.
Y que viene de los principios rectores, ¿no? Y de cómo, básicamente,
And
resumiendo
how
la idea un poco de los dos artículos, lo que vendríamos a defender
what we are
es
saying in the
que
articles is that
la lógica de la diligencia de vida,
the
o
logic of
lo
due diligence
que viene de los principios rectores, es una
or the
sofisticación
guiding
jurídica
principles is the
del discurso de la
juridical
responsabilidad social.
sophistication of the social responsibility discourse, the corporate social responsibility
Un
discourse.
discurso mejor elaborado, el discurso de la
It's
responsabilidad social
more
corporativa
well
es el principio
grounded or
basado en la idea de
formulated.
voluntariedad. Es una serie de
It's
principios voluntarios
rooted
que
in
fue
this idea of
lo que compone las
voluntary,
Naciones Unidas, ¿no? Y todo lo
so
que fue
like
la
the
primera
Global
década
Compact.
del siglo XXI. Pero en la segunda
In the
década,
second decade,
viendo las insuficiencias de la
looking
responsabilidad
at
social
the
que es manifesta
insufficiencies of
y
CSR,
viendo
which were
que
manifest,
el greenwashing y el marketing
and that
empresarial era suficiente para tapar
greenwashing and
los
marketing
grandes
were not
escándalos y las grandes
enough to
tragedias
cover over
asociadas
the
a los
scandals
abusos
and
empresariales,
tragedies
el
related
incendio
to
en Rana Plaza
corporate
de Bangladesh, de
violations.
Bangladesh,
So, for example, Rana Plaza in Bangladesh was the biggest one of all.
digamos que ahí viene todo el trabajo
Let's say
de,
then comes the
del
whole
profesor
work
Raghi
of
en
Professor
Naciones
Raghi
Unidas
in the
para
United
intentar,
Nations
bueno, pues
to
toda esta
try
sofisticación jurídica que le dé un
to
poquito más de armazón teórico a la responsabilidad
to give
social
it
y que no
more
esté tan basada en la idea de voluntariedad
theoretical grounding,
como en la idea de
to say that
unilateralidad.
it's not so much about
Que le abra
voluntary
a esa
attitudes,
diligencia
but
de vida.
there is this unilateral
Voluntaria
duty
es
of
vinculante,
due diligence.
es un
Diligence. It's not
una orden
voluntary, it's
obligatoria
binding, it's a compulsory
para,
norm
que impulsan los estados,
that
que pueden
states have to
impulsar los
impose
estados
upon
incluso en el plano
corporations,
internacional.
including at the
La
international
Unión
plane.
Europea está
The
a punto
European
de sacar
Union
una
is on the
directiva de
verge
diligencia
of
de vida y
launching
el
a
Tratado de
directive
Naciones
about
Unidas
due diligence.
lleva
The
camino de
treaty at the
someterse, de
UN
hecho, a esta
looks
regulación
like
europea
it's
sobre
going
diligencia de vida,
to a similar path to the European
pero mucho más
regulation.
vinculada a ese concepto.
So more and
¿Y qué
more
dice este
connected to
concepto
this
sobre todo?
concept.
Pues
And
quiere
what does this
decir
concept
que
say?
obliga a las
It
empresas a tener
compels corporations to
planes de
have
riesgos
plans,
que
risk
se prevenga
assessment plans,
sobre
risk
los abusos
prevention
de los derechos
plans
humanos, se prevenga sus impactos
regarding the
sobre los
human
derechos
rights,
humanos.
to
Pero
provide for
tiene
a forecast of impacts on
órganos,
human rights. But there are
instrumentos,
no bodies, no
mecanismos,
instruments, no agencies, no mechanisms
ni
that are
tampoco
public in
sanciones,
character,
posibilidad de sanciones
and even less
para
sanctions, the
exigirles
possibility of
jurídicamente a estas
sanctions to
empresas
demand that
responsabilidades
corporations
en caso de
carry out
seguir
their
cometiendo
responsibilities
abusos sobre
in
los derechos
case
humanos.
they
Por
continue
poner un
to
ejemplo,
abuse human
por
rights.
poner un
For
ejemplo,
example, if a
como
company like
Inditex,
Inditex
Zara y demás, ¿no? La
or
mayor
Zara,
compañía de
the
textil
biggest
española y una de las más grandes del mundo,
Spanish apparel
pues
company
bueno,
in the
tiene un
world,
taller clandestino
it has
en el
a
norte de Marruecos, en la
clandestine
ciudad de Tánger.
operation
Y en
in
ese sótano
Tangier.
donde trabajan
In this
decenas de trabajadoras marroquíes cosiendo
sweatshop
para Zara,
where
hay una
uh,
inundación inminente
hundreds
de
of
esas trabajadoras
workers are working for Zara.
en febrero de este año,
And in February this
que
year,
viven ahí
18
permanentemente,
drowned.
pero trabajan
They
para una
were they
subcontrata, de una
work
subcontrata, de una
for
subcontrata de Inditex. Inditex
subcontractor of Inditex.
tiene
If
un
Inditex
plan de riesgos
tomorrow
muy
has a
bueno
risk
y
plan that is very good
verificado por
and
consultoras privadas de todo el
checked
mundo,
by
que cumple
private
con todos los
consultancies
estándares de la
that
directiva europea y que puede ser el
applies to
futuro
all the
tratado
directives of the European
marco
Union, the future
internacional o los estándares de
treaty,
Naciones Unidas,
etc.
que no tiene pinta que vaya a ser nada muy radical. Cumple con todo eso.
So it complies with all the
¿Vamos a
norms.
poder exigir jurídicamente
Are
algo
we
a la
going to
matriz
be able
española con
to
la sede
demand from the
en
mother
España
company
de esa
in
compañía
Spain, the
por
corporate
estos abusos
headquarters?
en el norte de Marruecos?
So these were human rights abuses
Parece que
of
no.
yours or not?
Que,
We feel not
que con la
that
regulación sobre
with human rights regulation, with human rights, with due diligence regulation, they're going to say, look, but we're complying. This was not Inditex employees that drowned. So the exploitation will continue. So understanding, I said this very quickly, and in the articles we explain it more in greater detail. Could there be some interpretations of due diligence that were not so declarative, with more teeth, in other words? Could there be? So we would not espouse the idea, advocate due diligence, but we would actually have public audits and citizens' control with legislation, with sanctions. So a corporation that has a headquarters in Spain, then has a tax shelter in Holland, and has an operational headquarters somewhere else and operates in Colombia. How do you regulate a corporation like that? So this requires international norms. This would require international norms. So above all, to break through this idea that the mother company are formally different corporations and in relation to its subsidiaries, but it's actually different paws of the same animal. So the headquarters is this economic center of gravity, decision-making center, has to be responsible for all the subsidiaries. So that's where we would go. So due diligence is not our framework, but it could be accepted that there are strong interpretations of due diligence, potentially, yes. In Switzerland, there was an initiative to include in the constitution a new article where the extraterritorial obligations of Swiss-based companies, they lost by very little the vote of last year. It was a referendum. It was not lost by the overall figures of the votes, but because certain cantons didn't approve it. The referendums in Switzerland have to be approved by all the cantons individually. But who controls the risk plans is a multi-party control body with social organizations, with unions, with universities, and there are sanctions. Then if it's not the only document, then it could be that there would be interpretations, positive interpretations of due diligence, but it's not what is on the table right now with the European directive, and it doesn't look likely that it'll be the same with the treaty at the UN level. So therefore, in this whole idea of the guiding principles, and here I conclude, we should, so please do read the articles because we spell it out much more clearly. So we see it more as a break on the idea of having binding norms. So in other words, it would be more of a regression than an advance. It's better to have no deal than to have a bad deal. So a bad deal will mean that everything gets put boxed and filed away for a long time. This is the fight that we need to fight. The correlation of forces is not too favorable, but there are some possibilities. But we have to fight the fight at the UN level, at the regional spaces, in my case, in the European Union. So, and also at the national level. Here in Spain, in the Catalan and Basque regions, there's the possibility of public centers at the regional level, at the provincial level, so to speak, to have a citizens' control of the operations of Spanish corporations for their activities outside of Spain. Technically, it's possible, but quote unquote, but we need to have the social buildup of strength, the accumulation of social strength, of power. So it's already written down. There's jurisprudence, there's case law, but we need political will.
Thank you so much.
Political will, as always. So we continue doing what we can as people, as militants. This is the setting that we need to have. So there is okay. We have all seen how everyone is doing the militant struggle, and we thank you all.
If anybody feels like delivering their remarks.
Es difícil, es duro, el reto es grande. Genera un poco de pánico escénico. Pero bueno, en este caso, siendo la 1:59, ¿verdad? Nuevamente les agradecemos a todos.
Thank you so much for each and every one of you for being here. The event has been a success. Thank you so much for being here. And we are extremely thankful to you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for each and every speaker who joined us. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramiro, Charlotte Beck, thank you so much, Manuela, Pablo, Ignacio. Let's keep on working together.
Gracias a todos.